Oh shoot, that 3 hour difference.
Yeah, it is right.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we got a lot to share. People here are very curious about it. It's a good curiosity. You hear all kinds of stuff.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Good evening. My name is Noah Salsick, and I am a student project manager for the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clark Forum, the Center for Sustainability Education, the Departments for American Studies, Anthropology and Archaeology, Food Studies, History, the Center for Civic Learning and Action, and the Center for the Futures of Native Peoples, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's event, the Revitalization of American Indian Food System. This event is part of the Clark Forum's Leadership in an Age of Uncertainty series, which is sponsored by the Churchill Fund. At the beginning of every semester, the Clark Forum student employees get together and propose ideas for programs focused on contemporary issues. We then vote to select 2 programs to develop for the following semester. Last semester, I pitched my idea for this event and this speaker, and I'm so honored and grateful that this could happen. At this time, I ask you please silence all cell phones and other devices. In the event of an emergency, you may use both exits on the stage level, but accessible exits are located on your left-hand side behind me. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. During the question and answer session, we ask you please try and keep your questions succinct so that anyone who wants to ask a question may do so. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples that live with these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the reprogramming camp established as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879. The college bears responsibility for the support and recognition it provided the Carlisle Indian School, which was a federal effort to culturally assimilate and eradicate indigenous peoples. Accordingly, this is a living land acknowledgement, and it's deliberately unfinished. It will continue to serve as a project dedicated to helping our entire community better understand our past, our present, and our future. Honoring the land and its stewards reminds us that these acknowledgements are separate from the work they do. They shape it. They remind us of the importance of centering Indigenous voices not as symbols of the past, but as scholars and leaders of today. Tonight, we're honored to welcome one such scholar, Dr. Michael Kotutwa Johnson. Personally, I have been fascinated for a long time by the ways human society can live more in accordance with nature. At Dickinson, I am an environmental studies major, so climate change is front and center. Because it is such a focus of mine, I am acutely aware of how daunting the path ahead can seem, and I often feel caught up in despair. However, I've tried to make a more conscious effort to focus on my passions and all the positive action and hope that can also come out of this field. Sustainability is a large part of that hope. I've been thinking about what sustainable food systems could look like, and as such, I've become increasingly aware that the dominant Western approaches to agriculture are often emphasize technological fixes. Think GMOs, pesticides, and other engineered interventions. However, this is only one framework among many. Greater policy changes supporting the environment are, of course, needed, But in the relative absence of that, it helps to be reminded of grassroots initiatives by people all over the country who are already doing impressive work and have been. Tonight, we will hear about one such framework in the area of food production that uses indigenous knowledge to raise crops in harmony with nature rather than bending it to our will. Dr. Michael Kotutwa Johnson is a distinguished scholar and advocate for indigenous resilience. He's currently serving as an assistant professor at the University of Arizona's School of Natural Resources and the Environment. He also holds a position as the assistant specialist at the Indigenous Resilience Center there. Dr. Kotutwa Johnson's scholarly contributions focus on how traditional ecological knowledge can inform contemporary environmental stewardship, with a special emphasis on the intersection of indigenous cultures, land management, and climate resilience. He is a member of the Hopi tribe and a traditional Hopi dryland farmer, which is a practice that's been passed down for millennia. As part of his ongoing work, he founded the Fred Aptvi Foundation, which is an organization dedicated to growing traditional Hopi crops, developing a seed bank, and promoting a Hopi youth agriculture program that integrates the Hopi language. This is meant to foster cultural continuity and agricultural knowledge for future generations. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Kotutwa Johnson.
Thank you, Noah, for the beautiful introduction, and Amanda and everybody else who brought me here at Dickinson College. I've had a chance to walk the streets here and look at the historical sites. I'm always fascinated by the signs that read like 1776 or 1775 when I come from a village that was established in 1100 AD. So beat that one, I always tell people, right? And, I also consider myself a 250th generation Hopi farmer. So we've been doing it for a long time, and that kind of, when I talk to people at the Grange in Iowa, they're saying, wow, really? Yeah, and so, yeah, really. So we've been doing it for a long time, but I'm here today and I'm glad to be here. It was a great flight over here. I got stuck in Atlanta, but the rain, but I'm not used to the clouds and the weather. I did happen to go to Cornell University for my undergraduate degree, and that was a little bit of taking used to, but then I went to opposite and got my master's at Malibu and Pepperdine University, and here I am, so people say I'm well-papered. But other than that, I'm just glad to be here, and today my talk is going to be on the revitalization of the American Indian food system. And so what does that really mean? What does that entail? What are some of the problems of revitalizing that, and what are some of the problems of making that sustainable? But it also gives an insight on what some of the solutions are. And the most important thing that I hope we take away from this is the recognition that I feel like indigenous people should have, and that we're still here. We're not up on a museum wall in a black and white photo, which you saw earlier. We're off the museum wall, and we're not in the same confinement like we used to be. And so it's good to be here. I'm good to be free, and I'm just going to enjoy this conversation. So here I go with the revitalization of the American Indian food system. How did I get there? How do I get there? I've come up with a criteria that I use. It's all centered around that revitalization, and in the center part, you'll have these are kind of the funding sources, and then the natural resource areas, because that's what my PhD in natural resources. Then you'll have all these breakdowns, what I call collaborative criteria. You have traditional agriculture, nutrition, law and policy, and tribal community engagement. And so what I've taken is this holistic approach that I was brought up with and try to govern my research to bring everything up at the same time. And that's possible, but it takes a lot of work, and I'm always busy. And so only time in the summertime, because I have an extension tract, I'm able to go home and farm. That was part of my agreement with the university, that I go home and farm, because that is who I am, and that is what drives me and keeps me going. So, the revitalization of the food system is necessary. Why we need it? Because if you look at all these disparities, look at the rates of heart disease, diabetes, chronic liver disease, they're all way higher than the regular American population. Of all the minority groups, are the highest. And so we need to figure out ways to combat all that. There's a reservation down in southern Arizona that has about an 80% diabetic rate. 80% of the people have diabetes. And then also there's another reservation where they're diagnosing 4-year-old children with type 2 diabetes at that age. Now, what makes it unique about the one reservation that has a high rate, they're pretty well off because they have a casino, they get funded a lot, but yet they have these high rates of diabetes. Why is that? You would think that when everything we read from the socioeconomic standpoint of view, if you have money, you're doing well. But this is not the case. They have money, but they're not doing well. So we have to tie it to our food system, and I'm going to make that claim. So setting the context, why are the way we are? You know, people know a lot about Indians, but I think they see them from just the museum thing in other places. Or if we show up to some place, you know, I'm usually get invited to Thanksgiving sometimes. But, you know, it's more important that I think people don't understand the law or the federal policy that does that. So before I get into the media thing, I want to talk about just real briefly the Marshall Trilogy. That set the federal Indian policy that we have today. The most devastating one was this one, Johnson versus McIntosh. So what did that do? Well, this is the Supreme Court that came out with this decree in 1831. It says basically that Indians have the right to occupancy, but not the right to title to their lands. And so a lot of these social disparities are caused by that. In fact, a lot of social disparities across the globe are caused of that. Even at the United Nations, we have indigenous populations there, but they have another voice rather than their own. And so there's a lot of disparities. And so to me, that makes a lot of sense. And, you know, it's all based upon, as we know, the doctrine of discovery. You know, that's a thing where the people didn't think we were there, and then they found us. They said they found us, but that wasn't true. It was the other way around, and therefore, you know, we were told what to do and put on places on reservations and things like that, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but that's part of our process. But it's good to understand this. You know, I was giving a lecture to environmental law people today. And when they grow up, they need to take a law class to figure out how to make better policy and things that will work for people. So current state of Indian lands, and this is one of the problems that you see with as the doctrine of discovery. You know, like 87.55% make the most money that on the products that are come from Indian reservations. So we only make 12%. Non-natives make 87% using Indian land to grow their produce on. You know, and so that has to be looked at too. Why is it like that? You know, for one of all, a lot of native nations were all different. We're 525 federally recognized, but we're more than that with the state recognized ones and so forth. And so we don't do things that we're supposed to be doing because that's not in our blood, that's not in our heritage, right? And so as a result of that, part of that doctrine of thing, you have this thing what I call the heirship. So you'll have originally like what Jeffersonian did, he gave people 140 acres and a mule. We got 160 acres and whatever else we got. And so over time there'd been no probate. So that one piece of land that was originally 160 acres because there's no probate or no wills, now you have over 400, 300 something people owning that 160 acres. So when you try to do policy out there, it doesn't work. This was part of the Allotment Act. We went from over 100 million acres to I think around 40 million acres in a short time because of the Allotment Act. And so that was just, you know, dividing up big reservation lands and having people, when they moved out west, giving them some land and having them live there. And so that's how that got started. So on to the big stuff. You know, nutrient density, what happened? Why are we the way we are? You know, nutrient density is very important. It brings good health to you, you know, but how do we make it nutrient dense? We're still doing that at Hopi. That's a watermelon that we raise. It has a lot of seeds, you know, and I love seeds because I love to spit sometimes, and it makes a lot of sense to do that, but it's about nutrient density. So the stuff that you eat is who you become and what you're doing. So this crop biodiversity loss is an example, and that's kind of what's happening today. So I'm kind of giving you an overall picture of what's happening to our agricultural system. At one time, the commercial seed banks, they made, for example, over 370 sweet corn varieties. They're raising 370 here, 370 in the United States. Now we're just down to, I believe this picture says something like 12. What's happening to our food system? You know, how is this affecting not just indigenous populations, but everybody? You know, what's happening to the biodiversity that we need to sustain? Because without true biodiversity, you really have no sustainability. That's the number one thing. So one of the big problems is that now we're too narrowly focused. We have these 6 crops right here that are raised throughout the globe. You know, you have like corn raised in Africa. You have it raised everywhere. Why is that? Those crops don't do well there. The indigenous population's bodies aren't used to that. They have all these chemical imbalances because of that. And so we've just done all this stuff. Their only solution right now that they're offering is cover crops and no-till. Cover crops and no-till. Not, you know, planting stuff that was there before, but continuing to raise these crops. And I would make a claim that it was just for economic and profiteering by those people who do that. You know, so we have to call it what it is. And so why is that important? So why is biodiversity important? Because half of our global domestic product, GDP, relies on nature and biodiversity, half of it. But then, when you make a claim that we sit on 80% of global biodiversity on a mere 25% of land, how come indigenous people aren't benefiting from that if it has such a high rate of gross domestic product? 50% of our gross domestic product depends on biodiversity of nature, and you look at how diverse our lands are and our biodiversity, how come we're not benefiting from that? How come we're not participating in it? One of the main reasons I feel like that's the truth is because our agricultural systems are not designed to be economic models. They're designed simply for survival, identity, culture, and everything else. So it's opposite of what you see here on the Western market. And also with this high plants diversity, also you have a high language diversity within those areas. Now why is that important? Because all the plants, all the different types of crops have a name. There's a value to that. You know, that's relationship. And that's what I'm here to emphasize. It's the relationship that we have with our environment that makes it sustainable. It's not an economic one. It's a relationship. And I'll get into that a little bit further. But just to give something a name, right? It's not just sweet corn, you know, it's other different types of corn that we raise, and they all have a name, and that's the beauty of it. So what is indigenous agricultural knowledge? You know, what is it? You know, being a PhD now, I can come up with my own terms, right? And so, you know, it's what I call it is applied knowledge for raising food and other agricultural products. Now, this is the most important part. Grounded in indigenous belief systems and practices which have been time-tested for over millennia. That means that these things are integrated into our societies for thousands and thousands, if not time immemorial, which is a big term. And that's important because you learn how to take care of things and your extraction in your mind goes away because you need those things to survive. So your landscape's taken care of and everything else like that. It's very important. So that is indigenous agricultural knowledge. So what are the benefits of indigenous farming? Well, first of all, it helps reduce obesity because of the work that's required. You know, going out to your farm today, watching the young people go out and work and, you know, empty out stuff, food waste and stuff like that. Now, that's a lot of work, you know. And but I'm telling you, you do that stuff when you're young, you get the chance to work on a farm and work with your hands like that. As you get older, you'll appreciate it. You know, when I was 10 years old, I told my grandfather one time when I was out there, because my dad would put me out there, he was in the military, and I would be out there, you know, hoeing weeds and planting stuff, and then one day I came back and I said, man, this is boring. You know, last time I said that to anybody, because the next day I was up at 5:30 out there hoeing more weeds, planting more corn, doing all kinds of stuff, and I never said I'm bored again, but the values stayed with me throughout my whole entire life. And it's my agricultural practices and principles that brought me out of some crazy stuff that I got myself into as a young person. You know, and allowed me to succeed. But anyways, it reinforces family culture because everybody's involved in the process. It stabilizes families and communities so no one is hungry. You know, I guarantee you can go to just about any reservation here in the United States and you will see no homeless people. You know, there's high rates of all kinds of stuff like substance abuse and things like that, but we take care of our own. We take care of our children. You know, we bring them home, and that's important. You know, it's environmentally friendly, at least at Hopi, because we only have 1 to 5 acre fields or not 2,000 acre fields, because we're not trying to make a mess of the environment. If we had a 2,000 acre field, we'd be in trouble. I went to a John Deere business tractor equipment sale, and some of the guys were teasing me who I know who work for John Deere. So why don't we get you one of those 14-row planters, Michael? Get you one of those 14-row planters, and we could plant your field in like 10 minutes. And I said, well, that may be fine, but let me get 14 Hopis, put John Deere hats on them and a planting stick, and we'll do the same amount of time just as quickly. So it's kind of neat like that. But it's just trying to get people involved in the process. It also increases the concept of sharing, and you learn to have a real respect for the land and what it provides. When you work with the land, you learn how to respect the land, especially if your life depends on it, like at Hopi and other places. You have to know how that land's about, and you have to know what works. Simple things, for example, like knowing what side to put your windbreak on. If you put it on the wrong side, you know, the wind could just blow sand and cover up your plant. So it's just getting to know your environment. So food security. What is food security? Well, here's an example of food security. When we roast our Hopi sweet corn, because it's not irrigated in these pits like I have on the left-hand side or your right-hand side, you know, I can have that corn 40 years later because it stores that well. Just by hanging it and drying it out, it stores that well. So all I have to do is boil it or just let it soak in the water for about half the day and then boil it at nighttime and it pops right back up. That is food security, guys. Not only food security, but nutritional security, land security, all the securities that should be integrated at one time because you need all those to actually be secure, right? And so it's kind of cool like that. So this relationship with nature, you know, what is that? How many of us take time to actually see what's going on, to understand what the relationship with nature is about? You know, sometimes we understand the relationship with each other, but how do we relate to nature? This is just a beautiful example of that. You can see, this is my sandstone house that I've been building out, a traditional home that I've been building above my farms. And when I was building up here, up in this area right here, I looked under there and there was a bird building his house out of sandstone. And I took the time that day to say, hey, look, who's teaching who, right? It's that relationship, guys. This relationship that I can't emphasize enough that drives things to be sustainable. You know, it's something that we all forgot. Sometimes even my own people forget that. And so I have to remind them that this is what it's about. You know, this is what it's about. So, you know, why did I do what I do? Somewhat because, you know, this environmental and cultural knowledge is for the next generation of youth out there that need to learn these things. You know, I'm by no means an assimilationist or anything like that. I'm more about one to understand the kids so that they can understand me and that we can work together and that they can go out and get those opportunities that were promised, but they never came out to do. So it's just about educating them. There are other ways of looking at it, but the main thing that I like about working with our children out there and what I talk about is their identity, their cultural identity, who they are. They should not be going to school not knowing who they are. And that's our responsibility as elder peoples. And I'm an elder now, I guess. Used to be one, but I'm getting older. I go to hotels and, you know, get late to have these guys pick me up because I fall asleep, you know, but that's just part of getting old, I guess. So it's kind of like that. So this intergenerational knowledge, this cultural identity, what is that? You know, what does it mean to know your own culture? Well, this is an example of what they call Prophecy Rock. It was designated, you know, it was shown to me by my grandfather. A lot of stories that I tell are from my grandfather, and they're only my grandfather's and my stories and my family stories. I get in a lot of trouble when I say the Hopis do this or Hopis do that, or Natives do this or Natives do that, because we're all different. Even clan-wise in our own society, even the dialects are different. So it's very important that I say that this is what I was taught. You know, I'm not a generalist. Nor assimilationist, but I'm something. So anyways, and so what you have right here is you have part of my 250 generations right here. And so what I have right here is my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and then me right here. So that's 4 generations of Hopi farmers. You know, I'm not a big fan of technology, but I love this one because I was able to Photoshop myself in there. And I look good that way too, you know what I mean? And so it's all good. And so that's what it's about. It's like that, right? And so, but this rock right here, Prophecy Rock they call it, I guess, is our true self-way of sustainability. And remember that I said just earlier that, you know, the agricultural system is integrated into our cultural belief system. It's where we get our values. It's who we are as a people. In fact, this little ear that I'm wearing around my neck is for my sweet corn, and it's a perfect ear because it's filled all the way to the top. And this is our mother. So I wear my mother around my neck when I give talks because I need that comfort to actually get through sometimes. You know, it's very important. But so anyways, so right here, we have this world right here, and you could read about the other 3 worlds if you want to look at the Book of the Hopi or some other stuff that was written out there. And so, but this is what I was taught about this when my grandfather, we have 2 paths that we can go on. You know, right now we're in this world right here, which represents this world. And then so you'll see a bunch of us up here, you know, holding hands and then going up this bumpy staircase. Now, each of these bumps I was told is going to breed, because this was probably done around, some people say like 1300 AD or 1400 AD. We were found 1100 AD, but what that's representing is the present and also what things will happen to us. So what this is telling us is that we'll get all these conveniences, we'll get all these easy ways, you know, to do things. We'll see those coming. And so what happens is that path all of a sudden just stops. It ends abruptly. You know, down below, down here, the opposite of that is you'll have a farmer right here, because we're integrated. He continues to plant corn like he was told to do, or she was told to do. And you can see his path just goes off the rock. That's telling us right now that if we can hold on to our values and who we are as a people, that we'll survive the next world. We'll go into the next world, you know. And so, but what's most important is this line right here. This is what I am. I feel like this is what I am. I'm like the choice line. I'm helping people, my own people, and other people try to come down to this society that has values. You know, values are so important. I'll talk about those. We live in a society that I can make a claim a lot. Today's society that their values have been forgotten. The importance of your grandparents, the importance of your mother, your father, the importance of something that you don't have and then you have, it's just that type of thing. So I make a claim that, we need to hold on to our values. So you will not see economics at all that I know of, at least when I talk about farming, because that doesn't mean anything to us as a society. What it means to me is our survival, our identity, and stuff like that. So why and where Hopi agricultural knowledge, where did it come from? Well, it's our culture, guys. It's that generational learning. It's going up and telling stories that sometimes scare you, but they're meant to do that, so you won't do crazy things, right? And so it's good as a little kid, but it's really about the culture. So Hopi is our way of life. Let's start with that. It's our way of life. From a little kid, when we're about 2 weeks old, we're put a small little piece of sweet corn pudding into our mouths to tie us to the land. It's important. It's important to have that place. So it's really about that. It's about this kind of thing that kind of bothers me a little bit, but I put it in there to give an example. A lot of times you'll see photographs like this in museums of what we used to look like, farming out there, and then what we look like now. We're still farming, we're still raising the same things. But I'm not up here staying in a loincloth and anything like that. I know some people might think that might be a good idea, but I'm not going to do that, right? If you come to my field, I'm not like this farmer here. In order to move away from that romantic thing that we have here, we need to start having more photographs like this being displayed, that we're here, that we're like everybody else to some extent. But we're different. We've changed over time. But we're still there doing our same stuff, our same ceremonies, who we are, speaking our language. It's important. So the women's role in farming. I can't help but emphasize this is the most important thing about our system, besides our ceremony and our obligations to our societies. The women do everything. It's a matrilineal society. It's the women own the fields. They own the seeds. You have to go get the seeds from the lady folks. They own the harvest to distribute it properly, so no one goes hungry. They're the geneticists to some extent. When this harvest is brought in, they look for certain traits with certain crops, and then they save those for seeds and then distribute the rest. It's that type of women's society. And it has nothing to do with gender, guys. It has to do with having a balance in our society. It's when you go either way, you have problems, I feel. So it's about maintaining that balance. It's a beautiful thing. So this Hopi agricultural calendar, a little bit more of how we into this was by the Hopi Foundation, a great nonprofit out there on the Hopi Reservation. And so this is our agricultural calendar. It's tied directly to our ceremonial calendar. I think what's unique about this is this month, December. It's a dark month for us out there. We're not supposed to be outside doing anything like that. But it's a time for us to stay at home and tell stories. That's what that mouse represents, telling stories, reinforcing our culture, reinforcing our traditions. So we never forget that, because once we forget that, we're just like everybody else. We've got to hold on to those traditions in those places. So like I said, Hopi is one of the few places I know where corn is raised to fit the environment and the environment not manipulated to fit the corn. You understand that? It's kind of hard because that's a place where nothing is added. No pesticides, herbicides, mulch, not even water. It's all just comes out of the ground naturally. And I can tell a little bit more when I go about some of the techniques that are involved. But it's just about only using what nature gives you. I try to raise tomatoes out there every year, but I'm no good at it. I don't have the patience to go over there every day and water those suckers, man. And all the technology, because we have limited amount of technology capability out there, we just don't go into things like that. So, and if it works for 2,000, 3,000 years, why change it, right? It's good for us. So, indigenous agriculture is often place-based. I think that's one of the misconceptions that people don't understand, that they can't take my system as drought-resistant as it is and transport it anywhere. Why is that? Because it's not economically efficient. Our whole market system in agriculture is based upon quantity and efficiency. Quality goes out the window. It wasn't too long ago that they were checking quality of the corn plants in here. Now the only thing they check for in the corn plants is when they have to feed it to cows. So cows have space over us now in some of these agricultural products, right? And so we need to think about that. Why is that? And so, but it's just this indigenous agriculture is often place-based. Now, look at the corn and look at the melons. That's a great year. Now, an example is that we don't always have a crop. And that's okay too, because we're learning We're learning how to survive, not only from a physical standpoint of view, but a mental and spiritual standpoint of view. Now, why is that important? You know, when I was building my house, for example, the gentleman came down from Old Arabia and he told me to put seeds in my plaster and put it on the walls. I thought it was crazy, but then he came down about 2 weeks later and says, "You do it?" I said, "Yeah," and I showed him, and I said, "I can't see the seeds." And he says, "No, we did that because when we had these times of drought, because we've had 200-year droughts before, we've had these big droughts, we used to do that all the time because we always want to remember that we have food in the house." Can you see the psychological ability? When we have problems, we want to have something to help us get us out of that, right? So that's the beauty of that. You know, it's that type of integration that we have with our system that allows it to thrive. You know, it's not as prevalent as it used to be, but we're still doing it. And so this continuity thing, and that's kind of what I like to show, is like, here, so you have a black and white picture of crops, and you have a black and white picture of 1901. They do this all the time, like environmental GPS stuff, and you know. But look at the same crop in 2015, and then the other one, same one in 2015. The system hasn't changed. Why is that? Because we have over 3,000 years of trial and error and observation. Is this science? Yes, it is. We just don't call it that. That's just our way of life, right? You know, all my colleagues said, "You know, how much traditional ecological knowledge can you tell me? Do you have any TEK to tell us?" And I said, "No, the only thing I know about TEK is that it really means like the things my grandfather taught me." Because it really is that simple, guys. You know, we tend to frame, you know, the different names and give them scientific names, and sometimes we don't even know what they mean. You know, but breaking down simply is the things that my grandfather taught me. Now, I have to give an example of this because when I was working for the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they asked me to put cover crops because you have too much barren land. Regeneration says you have too much barren land, you know, too much spaces between your plants. But it works. We don't need all the inputs. It doesn't cost much, or if anything, just your labor, right? And that's the most expensive thing, but we're still doing it, and it works. Why change it? It's important because of the values that are associated with it. You know, there's two key factors in Hopi agriculture: the amount of snowfall we have because it soaks down over time, and the amount of rainfall we have, which is during the monsoon season. We don't get any rain all the way from March all the way to the end of July. So imagine having crops to grow without that type of irrigation, that type of precipitation. It's amazing. It's off the charts. Those drought-resistant varieties are in high demand, so I'm trying to find ways to protect those, and I'll go that way into my research. And so, you know, you can tell how strategically placed they are. So there's a monsoon storm coming in. That's located below my field, that big rock mesa outcropping. And then as a result of the runoff, I get all new minerals, all new nutrients just off of one event to flood it like that. Now that's not bad. Eutrophication doesn't happen there because the plants are already out of the thing. They don't stay more than a week because we don't have no rain for a long time. It soaks in after about a week. It's good. And those melons and that corn fill all the way up, beans fill all the way up, and they're good. You know, it's real good. Place-based knowledge of an example, you know, when I was working for the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they had told me to get, you know, soil moisture probes and help my farmers out. We can tell them where it's moist, where it's not. And I said, well, you know, let me save you some money, and we'll just look at the different plants, because we've learned over time that these particular plants have different root depths. And if we see an abundance of something like this over here, which is called rabbit brush, we know we don't have to plant that deep. And we know we're going to have a good crop, because they only appear when you have a lot of moisture in your soil. That's what they call traditional ecological knowledge, or the things my grandfather taught me, right? It's kind of cool. And so this observation determines plant spacing. So based upon that, I know how far and how close to put my plants. You know, that's a clumped plant right there. Real quick explanation of that. Main thing was soil moisture, but also that plant, you know, pollinates each other, because corn's a self-pollinating plant. So they hit each other and they help with that. They also shade each other during the hot area. You know, the predation comes, crows, they can usually pick off the outside ears, but the inside ears are tightly nestled in there. So it does a number of things, and it even does more than that. For example, down here below, you'll see after we harvest a crop that we have all that leftover residual. We don't take the whole crop. We don't scan it off and feed it to things. It's just laid on the ground, laid fallow, and then the next year, after this, when the snow blows across, it piles up against those things, and the following year we plant in between those rows, because that's where the moisture is at. So you get 7 things off of clumping in wide rows, and so you're able to go in there mechanically if you need to and actually clean those rows out with the weeds. Now back here, you know, going to Cornell University and I taking a weed or plant identification class, that was a hard one because you have too many dang weeds back here to look at. Too much stuff going on, right? So, but look at all the new soils that I got in from that one event. This is just a result of one monsoon. Look at all that new stuff coming in there. Don't have to rotate my crops. Don't have to do any of that stuff. It's important. But the most important thing that is this indigenous agriculture that incorporates our values. And I learned all these things: respect, nurturing, self-worth, humbleness, confidence, all that from that one system. All those values I took away. Now, I didn't realize those values until I was older, but I sure learned a lot, And also, what I really feel like this is important is just changing the narrative, the beginning. How do we change the narrative? How do we get recognition that we deserve? Well, first of all, we need to be invited to the table. So I've taken this simple definition of regenerative agriculture, which is a very sterile definition, and I added, land use management schemes adapted for survival, which are supported by culture, belief systems, and community. Because that's what makes us sustainable. That defines the word regeneration, regenerative. That is where it's at, guys. And it's not about the processes. The processes are important, the practices are important, but it's really about the why you're doing that. The kids need to know why they're doing that, and so this generation incorporates that, why you're doing it, because of your cultural belief systems and what you're supposed to be doing. It's all integrated in there. So it's taking a Western definition and changing it a little bit. The importance of recognition, we're always talking about the scientific method. You guys have probably learned about that. Ask a question, analyze the data, communicate your results. Now, we do the same thing, but it's differently. Like, for example, observation. Observe the environmental conditions. Go out there and look at that. This is what I love the best. Communicate your results. How do you do that? You share the harvest with your family and your community. You eat your results, guys. That's the beauty of it. It's the same thing almost, but it's different, and it's better because there's community involved in it. You bring people in with you rather than just isolate yourself. You bring people in with you. This is good science on the right-hand side. It's sustainable science. It's important. So, and what does this cost to reframe the network? Well, like, for example, look how it's classified early. It's like, so this is how we frame people's ability to actually communicate, GDP, based off gross domestic product. So right now, if you don't have a good GDP, you're labeled one of these: first or third world countries, low-income countries, developing nations, global north and global south. All based upon somebody's idea of what it means to be wealthy. Doesn't make any sense that way, because the culture and the values that we have are a lot more better than that. They'll last a lot more time than stuff on GDP. If someone crashes the market, what do you do then? You'll go from a first world or a big developed country to a no country, So it's important to recognize that too, that GDP is not everything. It's important, but it's not everything. And so what is the heart of evaluation? I have a lot of great people that fund me and a lot of private organizations, but they still want things like data. What kind of data do you have? Being a scientist, we always got to provide data. And really, the valuation tool is mixed up. If you really want to demonstrate impact in communities, you have to ask what the community wants. Number one rule: what do they need? What do they want? Not something you just give them to them because you think it's good. Too many societies have went south because of just taking stuff over there and giving it to them, expecting them to change. This is about it. So these are my key indicators of wellness: connection to community, community zuni culture, sense of belonging. Now, can I have a big number of this? No, I can't. Because the impact I feel when I see this and people respond back to me, it's off the charts. So we have to look at that. So I'm helping nonprofits organize ways where their community is first and they get to ask the people rather than just come up with something and want numbers just back. It's important. So, there's some solutions. So how do we get there? First of all, tribal governments need to set aside small tracts of land for upscaling of traditional agriculture. How do I get this food system back? There's big tribes in southern Arizona that have a lot of land, all the water rights, but they have nothing in the land for their people. Gila River with Ramona Farms, they have about 10 acres, but they have to pay twice as much as what they do to produce that with no subsidizations, and they give that to their people. The rest of the fields are in alfalfa and cotton, which are huge water consumers. And you can't eat that stuff. Maybe you can. I never tried, but you can't eat that stuff. We need to be putting at least 1 or 5 acres away for our kids and our schools for these tribes. They need to, in my mind, get with it, and so that they can help their own members. We need to do that. So I've got a big work to do that. Tribal governments, state governments, USD delivery programs need to support native-led food organizations, not just tribal governments, because these are the people that are the backbone of our society. When COVID was going on, it was these native-led nonprofits that were unloading the trucks, getting people fed. They were doing all that they could. The governments, of course, had a lot to do with trying to get some funding there, but it was most of the part, it was the community members that did that. So we need to find direct access to federal funding if that's the way we're going to go. Land grant institutions need to partner with tribes. I can't emphasize that enough. There's a reason why they call them land grant institutions. A lot of the land that they used to have used to be Indian land. You know, they've got a hold of that through these schools, but they don't ever give anything back. They don't give anything back, and it's hard for them to understand why they need to give back. You know, they make billions and millions of dollars off of that, you know, with property and stuff, but we never get anything back, and that's the honest truth. There's articles in High Country Today, other articles that talk about that. You know, tribal governments need to adapt tribal agriculture codes. If we're going to protect our seeds and who we are, we need to have our own codes. That's important. As a sovereign nation, or domestic dependent nation, more like it, we need to have our own codes. Non-Indian entities support tribes to help market their products. There's one that's doing that. So if we produce something, if somebody does want to have an economic gain, then we need to make sure that that's well advertised so that people can take advantage of that. And tribal governments also need to establish their own meat and food processing centers so we can help with the calamity that we had during the COVID problem. There's only four entities that do meat processing here in the United States. That's it. We need more of those, and not just Indian lands, but other lands that we can help, help do that to break up that supply chain issue. You know, this is one of the plans that I worked on. It's an actual it's a document that shows how to do that. You know, we have food, sub-hubs, processing centers, all the economics. The cost of that back in, I think it was 2020, at that time was only $3 billion to get that across Indian country to get. But they're not going to pick that up. I mean, to me, it's something's fundable. They wanted to improve the lives of everybody, because this not only would this help, Indian communities, it helps non-Indian communities, support urban gardens, support all the stuff that we're kind of taking away now, like small gardens and getting food, nutritious food to our people, everybody, not just Indian people, to everybody, supporting the small farmer. I'm a big small farmer guy. I got 5-acre fields, I understand what small farm is about. Plus my grandfather said, don't ever raise an area bigger than you can manage, because it'll just go to waste. And I'm getting too old to do that. Too old to get out there, but I still got it going on. I'm still semi good. So that's just a good plan. It's by the Native American Agricultural Fund. And so educating the next generation of youth. So a lot of the stuff that I think should be necessary is the focus should be on conservation and biodiversity. Research should involve Native youth and be conducted on tribal lands, because a lot of my emphasis is off tribal lands. We need to be done there so people understand it. And make land stewardship and community health a priority in our country. Make them a priority. So this is currently what I'm doing. First of all, I'm developing a process to make sure Indigenous communities can benefit from research related to seeds. Now, seeds are very important to me, guys. They're the lifeblood of who we are. In fact, our seeds are everywhere. Hopi seeds are in different seed banks, all over the country, all over the world. And I make a case that these seeds are the new boarding school children that we have in our today's society, because they're taken away, they're misplaced, they come home, they don't know how to do anything, and just absence from our area where they're grown at. We have to re-identify them, repropagate them, do the right thing so they can come home and have a place. 2 years ago, I was given seeds out of Glen Canyon that someone had discovered over there when it was being flooded in now Lake Powell. They were 800 years old, and I grew them out this last year. They knew how to come up, they knew how to survive, and they were so smiley when they have a beautiful look on their face. They're very important. Rematriation is very important. Taking care of seeds and propagating them properly is very important. Ask a question, this trying to find ways, because here in the United States we have the Plant Variety Protection Act. It's only necessary for corporations, I feel, and we need to figure out ways to buy into that, to get into that, so we're able to raise our own seeds. Here in the United States, seeds only grow out one generation, so that means if the farmer tries to go to the market and sell his seeds, he can't do that because he's under contract, and then he opens that bag. But those seeds die after just 1 year. You can't replant them. They have to go back to the company again. And it's all a monopoly, people. It's all a monopoly, right? And so that's how it is. But, what I'm doing with this particular indigenous seeds is there's a law out there called the Native American Game Repatriation Act. I'm trying to get them trying to make them look at like their cultural patrimony, so that they say have the same protections as sacred objects and other things. We can repatriate them back in a good way. Growing out seeds for upscaling of indigenous agriculture, I need to create incentives. So what a better way to incentive than just give somebody some seeds and say, hey, look, plant these. You don't have the excuse of, no, we're running out of seeds anymore. They're here, plant them. That's a good thing. Nutritional analysis, because I want to know what's in those products, in those varieties. We know that they're good. We know that they made us healthy at one time. We just don't grow them out enough to be really sustainable. So what I'm trying to do is find out what's in there, and then find substitutes to give back to our community in maybe a different form, but have that done. At the same time, still upscale our agricultural system again, you know? But also that data that I discover is I always work with entities that say they have a closed database, so that stuff is not exploited. You have to watch that. You know, drought resistance is a big thing nowadays, you know, so you have to take care of those things, right? And then mitigating risk to tribes. So some of the techniques, I've got a water conservation study on indigenous crops in Arizona, and I'm keeping that there because I want to know what technology works best before I even attempted to take it out to the reservation. Because like I said, you know, we bring new technology out there, but it often just sits there because people don't know how to maintain it. They're not taught to maintain it. It's expensive. So I want something that works at low cost. You know, and this irrigation is just a principle to do on a bad year and then find some land to set aside that I can grow out bigger crops, because land is also hard to come by. In fact, land tenure insecurity is our biggest problem as indigenous people throughout the globe, because like I said, we have the right to occupancy but not the right to title, so we can't make decisions that we like to make to keep that land the way it is, right? So that's important. So, you know, but my most important thing is creating opportunity for others, guys. You know, I get a lot of publicity, a lot of stuff, you know, on magazine covers and stuff like that. I hadn't made GQ, but I'm working on that, you know. And we have to make sure that, you know, the recognition that I gets passed down. It's just not about the Michael show. It's about showing and bringing that recognition so the other young people and other people like me can have that opportunity to do well and to be happy, to have families and appreciate those values. So it's very important. You know, so this is just some of the pictures of me taking opportunity. I happened to speak at the COP, I guess the COP event in Dubai. I've never been to Dubai, you know, it was a lot of sand over there and it's different, you know, and so it was an interesting experience. And then I've got these native science demonstration products going on. This is just to show people that what we do is a science. It's very valuable, that we're here, brings recognition, it does all that great stuff. Very important. You know, I also started my new foundation called the Fred Aptevie Foundation. Aptevie is a Hopi word for planting side by side, so it was my grandfather, so I thought I would do that. You know, a lot of my work and what I'm doing is based upon my grandfather and what my grandfather taught me. You know, we used to have a conference in Prescott, and he would always buy food for everybody for that whole week. And I asked him one time why he did that, and he says, because I don't want to see anybody go hungry, you know. Those are the type of values I have. It's about supporting each other, right? And so this facility, which Noah explained, will, you know, grow out traditional Hopi corn and develop the best practice, keep developing best practices. Hopi seed bank, so with community has access, you know. Hopi Youth Traditional Agriculture Program that incorporates the Hopi language, because it's very important you know your language, because it means so much, you know. And this rematriation of Pueblo derives these back to Pueblo communities so they can do the same thing too. We got a lot of that going on within the Pueblo tribes, but we need more of it. We need to get off the government dole to some respect that we're basically forced to be on. And a lot of this stuff, honestly, was our own fault. We did some of that stuff that we shouldn't be doing. We let that happen, and but some of it was forced on us. But what the bottom line is that we need to just keep practicing these things, and we need to do what we need to do because of the values and the community benefits that it has for everybody. So this is one of the main things I like to talk about, and this is just this One Seed, One Child initiative, where I take a seed in Tucson School District and it's a cup of soil and some water and give it to the elementary schools to just have them plant it. That's all I want them to do. I don't really mind if it doesn't go to maturity and they could take it home, but I want the kids just to have that benefit of planting something. Like I was telling you, you plant something, you understand why you're planting something, you feel good about it. You know, you watch it come up just a little bit. You know, watching a first or second grader's eyes light up when that stuff comes up is amazing. It's beautiful to watch. I'd rather do that than say the Pledge of Allegiance of the United States, to be honest with you. You know, I love to plant, and I hope the kids understand that. And this is a program that anybody can get involved in. Even a school like this can do that. It doesn't cost much. You know, that's how you integrate. You integrate community by doing something that may be a little different, but it brings people together. Planting brings people together. Unless you get tied into what kind of cup is that or what kind of seed is that, you know, forget about that. Just let the kids plant something. You know, it's amazing. You know, and what the main thing is creating a generation for these little Hopi kids here, you know, creating opportunities for them. I each gave them a little ear of corn just because that's their identity. That's who they are, you know. It's you're creating that next generation of people, that relationship, those values, those things that I hold dear to my heart, that makes me who I am today and allows me to share these things. And with that, you know, there's me walking my little dog out there, Soya, Mitch planting stick, you know, and that's it for today. And thank you so much for letting me come and speak.
It is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We reserve the first question for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. So with that, we are looking for our first question.
Hi, thank you so much. I think this was a wonderful talk. You were talking about solutions-based approaches, and I was just wondering how Indigenous and non-Indigenous farmers alike can attempt to stand up to corporate agriculture, which furthers the environmentally unfriendly practices that depletes our environment. I know that I'm from a farming community. Most people that I know absolutely hate what corporate agriculture is doing and wish they could adopt a more traditional ecological knowledge approach. So I'm wondering what you think about pursuing that as a practice.
Well, I think it really starts like what you have, the model you have here in the farm that I went to today. It's just bringing the students involved in that and showing them the value of what you're doing. It's not all economics. I mean, the outreach that they have there, you know, I think powers 20 houses or something like that. It's some small, but it's really, really impactful. And I think for the kids to understand that, I think, you know, what I find the most difficult is, even if the regenerative agriculture is a good thing, the American farming system is so tied up into the corporate system. There's really no way out. Once you start down that road, you can't relieve yourself from that, because you're buying the equipment, you're buying the seeds that resist the herbicides, and you're just tied into it. And it's hard to get out of, you know. And when I talk to farmers, like in Iowa and Nebraska, their values are really good. You know, they really care about their families, but they also care about supporting those families, right? So they're into a system that may be somewhat profitable, but it's not enough to really do what it needs to do. And so my approach on that and my value is to teach the kids at a young age, like the One Seed, One Child initiative, to show the value of agriculture, the different types of agriculture, if you want to look at it like that, but just to understand and have the experience that these things are important. You know, it's not everything is always the same, and the benefit to our own sense of place and who we are, I think, is the most important thing. But I'm glad you raised that question, because I think it's, you know, I never want to be saying that, you know, I hate big conventional agriculture, because I don't, because I understand that people are locked into that. But I just want people to work together. I like the farmers markets, you know, I like the small farming stuff, because that adds a lot of good things to it. It's when we get away from that and we monopolize things that we have these problems. But people are good people. I really believe that in general. It's just a matter of how we take the time to actually listen to each other and understand each other and get to see what each other's problems and joys are, that we really build these communities up. So that's kind of a roundabout answer of what I'm trying to say, but that's what I believe in. So thank you. Yes?
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. I really enjoyed hearing your talk, especially about inspiring young children through planting, because that's something that I've also experienced in internships in the past, and so like I really connected to what you said on that. And as I'm like going into education post-grad, I was wondering how, and kind of jumping off of that last question, how do you build like safe spaces where you can like foster discussion between Indigenous and non-Indigenous stakeholders, and yeah, like especially for young people, I think, with different cultural backgrounds. I don't know, how do you teach them to respect and care about each other?
Well, you know, it's kind of a hard question, because we do come from different backgrounds, but for American Indian people, it's really about understanding the plight we've been through, if you want to call it that. It's talking about like this doctrine of discovery, even though that it sounds very divisive. Unless you understand the issues first, then you can start talking about the problem, right? But you've got to understand each other's issues and then bring those out. Sometimes you cause conflict, sometimes you don't, but you've really got to understand. So that's how I would work with. If you're going to go into postgraduate education, you need to understand, first of all, who you are. I always tell people that where you're from and all that stuff, but just kind of understand the issues. If you're dealing with Indigenous people, you need to understand where they were from. Even though before they were relocated, you got to go back to all that and look at that. And then start asking your question, why is that? There's nothing wrong with asking why. It's not what they call, what is that term they use all the time? Racial conflict theory or something like that. No, these are just the facts, guys. That's all that is. These are the facts. Some people don't like to hear those, but they are the facts. I'm just talking about the facts. The doctrine of discovery, yes, that's a fact. That did happen. Plenary power did happen. So let's talk about the facts. Get to know each other, and that's how I deal with all that. So thanks for letting me answer that.
Hi, Mike. Around here, sweet corn is like a treat that we enjoy in summertime. Could you talk about how corn fits in your culture and like the different types of corn you have?
Well, it's more than just a treat. I think that's it's our life way. It's who we are. It's our mother. And I think sweet corn here is just I would literally look at if you want to do something like I'm doing, look at the nutritional density. Is it even healthy for you? Or is it just water? Water's healthy for you too, but it depends upon even water, because of what the plant uptakes and the variables that you use, the inputs that you use, can have a tremendous effect on you, right? And so, but I think for us, it's just respecting something so much that it's used in over, traditionally it's used in over 42 dishes that we make with corn, for one. And so it's our survival mechanism, but it's also used for prayer meal and things like that are very important. So there's that integrated relationship. So you tend to value it a lot more than in mainstream society. It's just not a commodity. It's actually a life force. And I think that's the biggest difference. It's that relationship you have with it, and you understand it, and you try to understand it, because that will help you survive. I think every time I talk about corn, every time I carry corn around with me wherever I go, it really does good things for me. It really supports me, and I try to do as much as I can to support that particular crop. It sounds kind of weird, but for me, it's just normal. And so it's kind of cool to do that. But I really enjoyed coming to your farm today and the work that you're doing with your students today. I appreciate that. Any more questions over here?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. I had a question about your slide on the involvement of women within seed and sort of those kinship dynamics that you have within the Hopi community. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, and then also the mention of the lessons that your grandfather taught you and how those dynamics have changed who you are today.
Well, with the women, it is a matrilineal society, so it's the women. You follow your mother's line. You're given a Hopi name by the aunts of your society. It doesn't have to be biological; it could be clan related, which is an extended family in its own way. And so they're very important on that, and it's just a beautiful thing to watch. And so there's a big role for that, and it's just more about respect than anything else. On the stuff about my grandfather, how that brought me what it was. It was, I've had my own troubles in my own lifetime, and my own getting involved in things I probably shouldn't have. But, for the most part, it's those values that I learned as a young man that really got me up. It's a matter of me actually working hard when I told him I was bored that one time. It's those type of things. It's that relationship we have with our elderly parents and our grandparents and stuff like that. So those are the things I value the most. And those are the things that, when I have trouble nowadays, I even something bad happens, I remember those values. And it allows me to slow down enough to see the little ant cross the road sometimes. And that's what we need. We need to take time to do that. And I think it's important. So those are the kind of things that I still take away, even today, even coming over here, little things I shouldn't be worrying about. She said, don't worry about stuff too much, just let it go. I think it's one of the things I forgot to mention that, when we came to this world, we were given a planting stick, a gourd of water and seeds, and that's how we were told to survive here. But the most important thing that was told to us is that we need to have faith in everything we do. Everything. And I get that tested constantly, but good things happened. For example, in 2018, we had a drought. I didn't plant my whole thing because I saw that when I was planting, dust was coming out of the hole I was creating. But that same year, in late July, we had a blast of rain, a big one. And that corn came up, and I was able to eat it fresh, you know? And what was the importance of that? Because if I didn't have that faith I was talked about, I would not have planted. But our society says plant every single year. Because your crops are like you're like corn. You need to adapt to the environment like the corn does. And that's so true. You know, I'm a big fan of, you know, preserving things with seed banks. We let them sit in there, and we don't propagate them. And when they come back out in about 100 years, when we're going to need them, are they going to even grow? Are they going to adapt to our environment? Those things are a life force. They're really beautiful. You know, when we start genetically modifying stuff, what are we doing? That's not our job. You know, our job is to plant those things, nurture them to create new generations of seeds. You know, it's not about the other stuff. You know, but we forget that because on a TV set, we just see all this fancy, you know, popcorn and potato chips. Stuff I love too once in a while, but I got a bad case of diverticulitis the other day from movie popcorn, so I'm giving up the movie popcorn. And so it's just what happens, but it's just that type of thing. But it's that type of relationship that I have, yeah. Way up on top up there.
Hi. You mentioned on one of the slides a few previous that you look into new technologies and how they might be able to be integrated into your fields. I'm wondering how new technologies can meld together with traditional practices and at how much they can without covering up traditional practices.
Okay, let's a real example I like to give. That's one of the best ones. Is that has everybody heard of the moldboard plow, the bottom two-row plow? You know, and the impact that had on creating the Dust Bowl. You know, I don't know if you even got that part back in your history here, but you know, there was an instrument that was used that would just rip the crap out of the soil, flipped it over. People still use it today to have new fields. But what Hopi did when we got that, when we were first given that, introduced that by people that came out there, mainly the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you know, try this, you can carve up your field better, you know, and some people did 10-acre fields, and it just, because there's very few vegetation, it just blew the heck out of it. You have a big sand dune there now, and so what we did was we liked the idea of that to some extent, and the only reason we have these new implements is because less and less people farm now. Like I was saying, we sometimes used to have planting parties, and we'd go out there and we would take care of the field. We'd work in the community like that and plant like that, hoe like that. But it's getting less and less, so we came up with what they call a one-row cultivator, which actually only takes off 2 inches of the topsoil. It's dragged by a 3-point hitch on a tractor. It just skims the surface underneath and cuts those weeds like you would do by hand. And because our spacing is so far apart, we can get mechanization in there. You know, here in conventional agriculture, once the corn gets to a certain high, you have a lot of trouble getting mechanization in there. So how do you deal with that? You use a lot of herbicides, you know, and that's expensive. Right? And so, you know, if you have a system that doesn't allow that to get mechanization in there, it doesn't cost hardly anything. And it does the same thing as a hoe. Now, the downside of that is that you need to be out there every day hoeing weeds and doing those things and keep yourself in check, you know, and even planting. And so when you introduce these new things, something has to give, you know. But that's why we have our ceremonies, to reinforce the stuff that we miss. But it's a dual-edged process, you know. It has both the positive and the negative flip of the coin there. And so you have to take it what it is, you know. And if I want to raise a crop and I'm managing a 1-acre, 5-acre field by myself in the summertime, then I have to use an implement, because I'd rather take care of my crop some way, somehow, than just let the weeds go in there and take it out. It's important that way. So it's a give and take relationship, but everything's a give and take relationship, right? And so it's kind of like that. But thank you.
Hi, thank you again for this. I'm from an urban area and I love my city, but a lot of the health disparities that you showed at the beginning show up in big cities in the US, within communities where the closest thing and the most accessible thing you can buy are things that are really not nutrient dense and that can cause health deficits. But within that, you can't de-urbanize a heavily urbanized space necessarily. You can't always go back. And so do you think that there's ways to convert a lot of the traditional knowledge that you know on like your farms and spread out land into those types of initiatives like One Child, One Seed and different school or community projects? Or do you think it has to be restructured to a higher degree?
Well, I don't know. The restructuring is very necessary, but I was out there talking to a guy from the Bronx. He says, I think it's Green Machine or something like that. He's in New York City, and he has ways that his schools have small little gardens in their space. It's very hard to find doable land in the cities because there's so much, congestion and everything's being built on the good arable land in the globe and actually in the world. And so my answer to that is also that One Seed, One Child initiative. I think, now, under new legislation, everybody's aware of the SNAP program and the things that they contribute to lowly society. They're going to probably cut out pop and processed foods and stuff like that we can buy. Now that's going to do one of two things. It's going to go either one a good way. It's going to make those places worse because they're going to have to go somewhere else, or it's going to make it better because then we have to find food to substitute into these markets. There's really not much of a difference between a marketplace in the inner city and also on the reservation. They're similar. We have the same types of foods out there, and everybody's getting sick from that. So why not, at least on the reservations, why not get government contracts with people like Trader Joe's or Whole Foods and truck that food out there. Transportation is a big thing, but get good foods out there and also find ways to raise the foods that we're eating traditionally. Now I say that, traditionally when I say that, like I said, not all Indians are the same. We don't have the same culture. The buffalo culture, like, in the Dakotas and stuff, was very thriving, and then the government came in there and just wiped out all the buffaloes, right? And so we need to figure out ways to figure out how we can revitalize at least some of that. That film Inhabitants that I watched, that I'm a part of, there was a thing on buffaloes in there, and even people that have been removed for 80 years didn't know how to get a hide and harvest a buffalo anymore. It's crazy. And so we need to find ways that we can do that. But with the cities, there's a lot of good programs out there. It's just, do we have funds to support that? I think one of the things that is absent the most is that people don't understand that when you start a community garden, you also need to have funding for someone to manage that community garden when the rest of us are out there playing around. You cannot manage something if you're not there, right? And students are only there part of the time. You guys are great, you help, but when you're gone, guess who gets to manage it? You need that extra arm out there. It needs to be funded. It needs to be just like teachers' aid. You need a community part of the budget to a community gardener to help with that, and stuff like that to keep that going. Because once the land takes it back, it's back. It's start all over again. There's nothing wrong with that either. But it's just making sure things are well supported and the resources are there, and putting human people at the top of things, not at the bottom. That's the most important thing. So.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned earlier that you're currently fighting for seeds to be recognized as cultural patrimony under NAGPRA. Are you currently in contact with institutions or seed banks, and have they been receptive to that?
Well, we're doing a study. Part of my Rockefeller Foundation grant is to looking at the processes that museums and institutions like that have as far as rematriation is concerned. The USDA has an example where certain things are put in black boxes now for that indigenous seeds, so that they're just not easily accessed. But for the most part, it's just people just have them, and we need to figure out ways to get them back. And so that's one of the surveys that I've got out there that I'm going to be doing a paper on pretty soon. Just see what the access is. You really got to understand the barriers first before you can actually come up with the solutions. At least that's what I was told. And so, so that's basically what I'm doing on that particular question is trying to see what the barriers are, so I can try to find solutions to alleviate those barriers. So thank you. Someone had their hand up one more time. And also, a lot of my work is on Instagram. Instagram, I call it. It's Dr. Hopi Farmer. It's a cool page. It's all about my philosophies and just pictures of me on there. And so, thank God for biodiversity, because everybody looked like me. It'd probably be a better place, but other than that, you get bored.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us today. I think we all really appreciate it, obviously, since we're here. I just wanted to ask, you touched on the topic of waste a couple times throughout your presentation, maybe not making it a main focus, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on the role that waste plays in our food systems as of today, and how that challenge can be addressed.
Well, you know, food waste is a big problem here in the United States. So many people are going hungry that don't need to be hungry, right? I mean, it's just, you know, one of the things that you do here that I understand is you take a lot of your waste and it's shipped out to the farm. They make, you know, gas and electricity out of it. It's a good thing to do. I really respect that. Wish more people had that. But, you know, the food they take out there, you know, you also could distribute some of that to people that don't have that, you know, with community food banks and things like that. And it's important. And, but, you know, food waste is a big problem. I mean, we're a big society. I mean, we have a lot of people have, you know, we're well offered than anybody else in the United States as far as, you know, if you want to raise it by, you know, socioeconomic status, you know, but yet we have all this waste, you know, and yet our divide gets bigger and bigger between the have and the have-nots, you know, and we need to find ways to utilize that and to help people more than anything. And I think, you know, food waste is a big problem, but here you're doing a pretty good job with it. You know, if you can't give it out, you're using it to make, you know, renewable energy that's not leading off to, you know, CO2 emissions. But people often forget that our biggest polluter here in the United States is not CO2 emissions, but it's agricultural runoff. You know, it's really big here, and so we need to figure out ways to curtail that. And but you know, being, you know, as young people as I met, you guys have the whole freaking world ahead of you. Think about that. You have all this opportunity. You can do a lot of things. But my only advice is that you always do things to help other people. You know, and by collecting food waste is the best way to do that. To make sure, like my grandfather said, nobody goes hungry. Right? That's important. And I think that's a good way to leave this forum. You know, opportunity in helping people. You know, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for letting me talk tonight. I appreciate that.